Understanding bandwidth is critical to using IP cameras. And this is different from the old days with, say, a 4-channel or a 16-channel DVR. You just don't plug things in. There's a lot more functionality in terms of higher resolution, even higher frame rates, but the trade-off is you need to understand the bandwidth implications. Bandwidth can range from little amounts to huge amounts. And so what we want to do is we want to show this to you in action. The first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to have a tool that measures bandwidth. And there's lots of ways to do it. But the easiest way that's available for really any Windows PC is the Task Manager. So you talk about Control-Alt-Delete. Normally in the Task Manager, you might come up to applications, or you might deal with processes to kill a process, check what's going on, etc. But it also has a networking tab, and this networking tab can become really handy to check how much bandwidth is being used connecting to your VMS, your NVR, or to basically just your PC if you're viewing cameras. You'll see right now that there's zero network utilization, which is basically telling us we don't really have any cameras, we're not browsing the web, we're not doing anything. But once we start turning cameras on, we're going to see basically how this changes. So let's go and connect to a camera. Okay, we've got a blank Internet Explorer tab, and we're going to connect to a camera. And let's look as the camera loads. Let's look what happens in the Windows Task Manager. All right, so 15, 23, 27. Now, this camera is just reporting its bandwidth in real time, but that's only a minority of cameras actually do that, but that is a useful feature. That's, though, why we want to use the network utilization to get a better sense of utilization across multiple cameras. So let's focus now a little bit more into the Windows Task Manager. So we've got our camera running, and it's saying 24% of 100 megs. That's the other part that's really key, is how much bandwidth you have in your network. How big is your pipe, right? Do you have a 100 meg pipe, a 1,000 meg pipe? 100 and 1,000 are the two most common. 100 is what you generally get if you bought a switch at your local electronics or computer store. Now you're going to see here that this one camera by itself is consuming more than a quarter of the bandwidth. So that might say that, like, well, 4 cameras are going to max out your network. That's not correct. Let's show you basically that there's some things that are going on that has a big impact on bandwidth. One of the most famous things that impacts bandwidth is codec. And you'll see here that we're using Motion JPEG. Now, Motion JPEG for displaying video just for a moment can be fine because it can be displayed anywhere. But in surveillance, people overwhelmingly today use H.264. So I'm going to switch to it for you, and let's take a look at what happens. Okay? It's going to reload. Now, we were at 30 megs. Now we're at less than 3 megs. So you can see here, just looking at this graph, is that we were up here at nearly sort of, over 1/4 of the network was being used, and now we're not even using 1/20th or 1/25th of the network. So that's a significant drop. Now that's not the only drop. There are going to be other changes in bandwidth that you need to keep in mind. For instance, most cameras and most people in surveillance use variable bitrate. But if you, for instance, turn out the lights, you'll see here that we were at 2 to 3 megs, but look at what's going on here. 6, 9, 11 megs, right? So we've jumped a lot. So we've jumped, by a factor of 3x. And if we turned on a strobe to show you a combination of motion, you'll see here that we're 8, 9, 11. So bandwidth has gone up yet again, even a little bit more, because now it's dealing with more motion. 13 megs, 14 megs, right? 16, 19, as basically the scene gets more complex. So it's really important to keep in mind the bandwidth in your scene, not only basically for a specific camera, but over the course of, or a day, or over the course of time. Now let's switch it back to basically to our lights, just our regular sort of daylight. And we're going to go back down to that 3 or 4 meg. But even this now we're at a little bit over 2 megs. This still is probably more than often the amount of bandwidth you're using. For instance, this camera is 720p, which is fairly a normal camera in terms of resolution in this day and age in surveillance. But it's right now at 30 frames per second. So let's show you differences in frame rate so you can see how this impacts your overall bandwidth utilization. Okay, we're back. So we changed the frame rate, and look at what's going on here. Before we were at 2, 3, 4 megs. Now we're basically a half a meg. So we're down dramatically. So what did we do? The frame rate was 30 frames per second, but we went in and we changed the configuration to 5 frames per second. And statistically speaking, more often than not, people are using 5, 7, 9 frames a second than they are using 30 frames a second. And you can see here that this dropped bandwidth by 60, 70%. So if we look back to our task manager, our network utilization is we're really only using about 1/100th or 1/200th of the network. So this is for an individual camera. So we could use a lot of cameras. Now, let's do another thing. Let's turn on a number of cameras so you can start seeing what happens when you have a lot of load on a system. Okay, we're back now. Let's go into Windows Task Manager and look at what happened. And it looks basically, right, like a hockey stick or a rocket ship, right? We were down less than 1 meg, and now we've basically gone over 80 megs. So that's a huge jump in just a few moments. So what did we do? Well, let's show you. Now when we go back to our Internet Explorer, we've got multiple tabs open. So we've got 1 camera, 2 cameras, 3 cameras, 4, 5. So we have 5 cameras running now at various bit rates, resolution, etc. But you can see here is that you're approaching the max. This link limit, right, is 100 megs. And most people in networking would say don't go over 70 megs. So there's a problem here. This 5 cameras is basically overloading the network. Now again, this is not necessarily representative. Basically, we have it at Motion JPEG. We basically have it settings that you wouldn't normally use. So let's show you what would happen if we optimize it for real world use. Okay, and we're back. So let's take a look at what's going on in our Windows Task Manager. We were over 80 megs before, and now we're at 20 megs. So just by a few clicks, primarily just turning off Motion JPEG on H.264, we're down to 20 megs. We're still basically running all the cameras at 30 frames rate. If we drop that down even further, we'd probably down to under 10 or under 5 megs. And so those cameras would only take a few megs each, and we could fit many more cameras, 10, 15, 20 cameras on this network. But you can see basically how much it varies. For instance, let's turn off our light. We're not even going to show you the cameras. We're just going to turn off the light. And so let's see what happens when we turn off our light here. We were at 20, right? And now we're at 30. So, right, we've gone up 50% just in a moment by turning off the lights, and it's gone down to 25, to 26. But you can see there will be these types of variations. We'll put our strobe on for a second. And there you go. You see it spikes now to 50, 45. 47s, right? So basically, those are the types of variations that you're dealing with. So to pull it all together, let's review a couple things that are really important. First of all, you're going to need to understand how much bandwidth your camera takes. That's lesson number 1. And when you do that with how much bandwidth your camera takes, do it in different scenes with different codecs, resolutions, times of days, people in the scene, people out the scene, so you can learn a little bit more about that. Then you'll need to see how much bandwidth you have on your network. Is it a 100 meg network? Is it a 1,000 meg or a gigabit network? Are there other services or other things running on that network that basically you need to allocate for? And then finally, pulling that all together. How many cameras? What are the profiles of all those cameras? All of those things will help you put together and better understand and make sure that you can optimize your use of bandwidth on surveillance systems. Thank you.